Everyone, and a very warm welcome to everyone watching and to Kaine Ugwu, who is going to be bringing this presentation to the table. Really looking forward to this one, designing the Foresight-Driven enterprise. So I won't take up any more of your time, Kaine. Thanks for joining us today. The stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Philip, for the warm introduction. I'm super excited to be here today to share a pretty much abstract concept to many of us as enterprise architects. And the idea today is to expand the way we think. And hopefully by the end of this talk, this concept of foresight will be a bit more concrete for us as enterprise architects. So let's get to it. Every time I visit the United Kingdom, I'm always intrigued by this building. So this building on screen, this is the Swiss Re building, or it's popularly known as the Gherkin. Now, the Gherkin, its architect, he's known for building bold, futuristic designs. They're usually beautiful if you see his buildings, Norman Foster, and yet they're architecturally sound. In fact, most of his buildings win awards. This particular building, the Gherkin, is known to have won a lot of awards, especially when it comes to sustainability. But I also like, apart from his buildings and his designs, I also like this quote which he made, which he says, as an architect, you design for the present with an awareness of the past for a future that is essentially unknown. So this is classical building architecture. But when we bring it into what we do as enterprise architects, assuming you are hired as an enterprise architect for an organization, one of the first things that we do is that we speak to people. So just looking at the talk from Lisa earlier, the keynote, it's very key to talk to people. Why? Because we want to understand the context of that organization. We want to understand the history. We want to understand the culture, how they do things in that organization. It's only then that we could architect for the present. We could create a best fit or fit for purpose architecture. And of course, enterprise architecture is about change. So we have to ensure that that architecture that we create or we design could enable the organization to adapt to change and remain competitive. Now, before we go too far into the future and talking about the future, let's talk about the past. So this is a classical story from BlackBerry. BlackBerry used to be one of the world's leading phone manufacturers. In fact, in the early 2000s, they had 20% of the world's market share globally. In the US alone, 1 in every 2 smartphone users was using a BlackBerry device. BlackBerry were so dominant at the time, they had a QWERTY keyboard, they had email on mobile, there was this instant messaging app called the BlackBerry Messenger. It was kind of exclusive to just BlackBerry users. They had best-in-class security architecture for mobile at the time. But what they didn't have was the ability to sense signals. So they didn't see what their competitors were doing, competitors like Apple, and making away with the keyboard. They didn't see the rise of the developer ecosystem and the rise of the app stores, Google Play Store, the Apple App Store. So the result of this was that the once dominant player, by 2016, they had 0% market share. They had to pivot to security solutions. Let's look at another story. So this man you see here, his name is Steve Sasson. Steve used to be an engineer for Kodak. In fact, he was literally holding the future in his hands. Now, this toaster-sized device was the world's first self-contained digital camera. His company at the time, they actually patented this invention in 1977. However, they viewed this invention as just a technical experiment. The reason being, just like BlackBerry, they were the market leader when it comes to film. So they felt that this opportunity at the time would cannibalize their business. They also assumed that film would always be more relevant than digital photography. And this was the implication. So this is how wrong they got that assumption, because most people, of course, prefer the convenience of cloud storage over film and over physical prints as well. And the result was that Kodak, the once dominant player when it comes to film, they became bankrupt in 2012. Now, how can we correlate what happened between BlackBerry and Kodak? The reason being they were thinking about the future in a straight line, linear thinking. So they had the current state. We had to keep optimizing our architecture to create the target states, the future state architecture. The challenge here is we can't architect for just one future. Even for most organizations today, this is how we create architecture. We think of the baseline architecture, we make sense of it, we create a target architecture or a future state architecture, and we create the steps, the transition architecture to get there. This is false certainty, because the future, as we know, is not a straight line. Now, the reason I'm talking about this is because I want to expand how we think about the future from a futurist mindset. So we hear a lot about futurists and the profession of futures and foresight. This is how they think about the future. So this is a common model to them called the futures cone. So the idea here is to introduce different futures and how to think about it and prepare for it. So I'll just run through some of the concepts that you see on screen very quickly. So when we talk about possible futures, now possible futures means all conceivable scenarios. So it could be knowledge that we have today, as well as knowledge that we do not possess yet. An example could be, it's possible that I could win the lottery tomorrow. It's also possible that in 10 years, there could be another pandemic. In terms of knowledge that we do not have or do not possess today, it's possible that in a few years or in some time in the future, we might discover a planet that could sustain life. That's also a possibility. If we move to plausible, now plausible means things that could happen. And here is based on current knowledge of how things work today, our current knowledge of how things work today. It also includes probable futures, which includes things like trends. So if I take a very simplistic example, fashion trends. The problem with trends is trends come and go and new ones emerge. And it's still, again, false certainty. So if we move to scenarios, many of us are used to scenarios, but from a foresight perspective, scenarios means the structured, plausible stories that we create of how the future could unfold. And we do this to test or to stress test our assumptions of today. And finally, preferable futures. So preferable futures is subjective. So the preferable future of one company will be different from the second company. It is what we want to happen in the future. And an example would be a preferable future could start out as a vision, something that we want to happen. We don't know how to get there yet. We don't possess the knowledge yet. But eventually, over time, it could move to a plausible space, and we could actually achieve that preferable future. And that is the essence of foresight. Now, foresight is the concept that ties all this together. And there's this very simplistic explanation or definition of what this concept is from Mary Conway. So foresight is the capacity to think systematically about the future to inform decision-making today. Now, how do we do foresight? There's another framework from Joseph Voros. Joseph Voros, he's a futurist and also a professor of foresight at the Swinburne University of Technology in Australia. And he created a framework that you could use to start thinking about how to apply foresight. So it starts from inputs. So inputs means strategic intelligence. You're doing your environmental scanning, you're gathering data, and then you start the foresight work. So foresight work is 3 parts. So the first part is analysis. Here you do a lot of trends analysis. You look at questions like what seems to be happening around us. And then we then move to interpretation. So interpretation is looking beyond the surface. So you're looking at questions like what's really happening. Here you put on your systems thinking hat and go deeper to understand the reasoning behind different trends. Then we move to prospection. So here we ask questions like what might happen. So this is where scenarios start playing a part, scenarios and scenarios planning. It's only then that we create outputs. So outputs are the expanded perceptions of strategic options. What might we need to do with all this? Here we run foresight workshops, we do foresight reports, and then we then inform strategy. So this is a key distinction because foresight work actually comes before strategy and strategic development. That is, what will we do? How will we do it? And of course, enterprise architecture is how you then execute this strategy. And of course, there's also enterprise design, which encompasses other disciplines like customer experience, user experience, and all that. So each time I take I travel with the aircraft, so traveling is one of my greatest fears, especially when there's a turbulence. I'm always scared of flight. But what I used to take off my mind is I start thinking about that model, the model of the aircraft that I'm flying on. And I think about how did they actually create this latest model? What the aircraft manufacturers, what they do is that they create a prototype of this model and then they put it in a structure like you see on screen. This structure is called a wind tunnel. The whole essence of this experiment or this activity is to test this model or prototype against different atmospheric conditions. Conditions like wind speed, air pressure, to see how resilient this model would be. There's a foresight method called wind tunneling. And wind tunneling does exactly the same thing to your strategy. And this is how it works. So assuming we have created different scenarios, which are plausible stories of how the future could unfold, and we have our pre-existing strategies. So we have our marketing strategy, as you can see in the example. The marketing strategy would be resilient in all 3 scenarios that we've created when we test it. However, our supply chain strategy would only be resilient in scenario 1, and it will break in scenario 2 and scenario 3. So as enterprise architects, one of the first things we think about is how can we support this strategy? And we think of the word capability. Now, capability is what we do, basically, as enterprise architects. It's also defined in layman's terms as what an enterprise does or intends to do. Many of us are familiar with the concept of capability, but not many of us are familiar with the concept of dynamic capabilities. Now, dynamic capabilities is the firm's ability to integrate, build, reconfigure internal and external competencies to address rapidly changing environments. And it's made up of 3 process steps. So the first step is sensing. So sensing means the company's ability to look at the different opportunities and threats. And seizing is the next step, which means being able to actually mobilize resources, create new business models in order to capture those opportunities that you've sensed. And finally, transforming means being able to reconfigure your enterprise, your structure, your assets in order to ensure that your enterprise remains adaptive and competitive. So that's dynamic capabilities. There's ongoing research as well, which looks at enterprise architecture as a dynamic capability. And this is how can we support sensing, which is, for example, scanning for opportunities, looking at different threats. And here I did a mapping of aligned EA services that we already currently do. So an example would be tech radars, trend radars. In fact, when I used to work for a retail company in Europe here, we had a tech radar. And what we did was we look at different emerging technologies, programming languages, platforms, libraries, and we were looking at the impact of this emerging tech on the business, and not just on the business, on the industry as well, and it was publicly available. So this is one way that enterprise architects can support sensing and looking at different signals. When it comes to seizing opportunities or mobilizing, we can support here with portfolio management. We can support our portfolio managers. We can do roadmap prioritization, and more importantly, ensure that we have architecture-informed decisions. And finally, transforming. When it comes to transforming, the key here is architecture-governed change management. We can support with architecture-governed change management, which also includes, from a technical perspective, evolutionary architectures and ensuring the principles of fitness functions are applied. So I've said a lot, but we wear a lot of hats, right? So sometimes we wear the hat of the solution architect. That's the truth. We have to really go deep into the engine room sometimes, handhold, ensure that delivery is actually executed. Other times, we are called to the boardrooms or to leadership tables to give an architecture point of view, and we act as a facilitator. So today, as part of this talk, I'm challenging you to also put on the hat of a foresighter. That is someone who is actively looking at the futures for the company. And not just looking at the futures, but looking at the implications of different trends and technologies on your business. So to recap, how do we move from an unaware enterprise to a foresight-driven enterprise? So we start by understanding foresight as not just a practice, but a cognitive skill that we can hone, and we start applying foresight activities. When we do that, we start having more strategic conversations with our leaders. So we're very good technically, but we also need to start looking at these strategic conversations. And then we create cognitive shifts in these leaders. So people start testing assumptions. People start looking at scenarios and having optionality. So it's no longer just one future, one target architecture, but how do you have alternative architectures? And then we then say that we are now having dynamic EA capabilities within our enterprise. So when we do this, of course, the enterprise will start having better decisions, and we won't be like Kodak or like BlackBerry. So I think that's the end of the presentation. I packed a lot in this presentation, and it's just 20 minutes. So what I've also done, if you scan the QR code, you will go to my website where I've listed and curated all the relevant research in terms of integrating foresight to strategy and also to enterprise design and architecture. And yes, I will now check if there are any questions that we could take. Let me look through the charts. So Maxine, I love the idea of dynamic capability, but I wonder how we can activate the transforming part. How do you engage leadership in this part? I mean, I believe that this is something we already do. I believe enterprise architects also already many of us already wear the hat of a futurist or a foresighter. So, like I mentioned, the EA services that we could use to support transforming process type of dynamic capability is looking at supporting change management and ensuring that there's architectural governance there as well. I hope that answers that question, Maxine. The next one is, do you think what holds back foresight-driven EA in most organizations is that architects, even business stakeholders, tend to stick to decision-making based on what technology is available or perhaps tech fads? And this is a good question. I think so. So many of us come from technical backgrounds, and we don't pay attention to this concept of foresight, especially in the age of AI. There's AI, there are other technologies, there are other trends. But when we start applying these different foresight methods and these cognitive skills, we can influence our leaders who are not always looking at the next fiscal year strategy, but could start looking at how can we look 5 years, 10 years into the future for our business. Let me see if I can take one more. We have, I think, 1 minute left. How does the concept of dynamic capabilities relate to the so-called transformers? Are transformers just the technology aspect or covers further than that? I'm not sure what you mean by transformers, right? So dynamic capabilities was coined by David Thies. He's a management theorist, and he coins the dynamic capabilities framework, and he created 3 process steps. So transformers, I'm not sure what you mean by that, but transforming is a last process step when it comes to dynamic capabilities. And that means being able to transform your enterprise to ensure that it remains adaptable and competitive in light of rapid change, AI, etc. I hope that answers your question. But if it doesn't, please feel free to reach out to me. And we have 4 minutes left. Yeah, I think that was the last question. But Miguel, feel free to reach out to me if you want to dive deeper into that, your question about transformers and its relation to dynamic capabilities. There's one question that popped up. What's one actionable foresight practice EA can adopt now? Scenarios. I mean, we're already used to scenarios. I think the Open Group has a page on business scenarios, which is defined differently from the way foresight practitioners look at scenarios, but it's the same concept. Being able to create scenarios, scenario thinking, and not just that, moving it into how we create architecture, and alternative architectures, optionality, to ensure our enterprise is prepared. So thank you so much for the opportunity to present. Feel free again to go and look at the research I've compiled. And thanks for your time.